You just heard that creak, the quiet signal of a kettle over the fire. It is more than a sound. It is a warning in the cold. Welcome to Unexplained History. At the center is one question. How does scarcity become something that haunts the body, the community, and the spirit? We trace the Wendigo Complex, a tangle of teachings and stories from Northern Algonquian worlds tied to winter hunger and the impacts it leaves. Stay with me. If you like the show, follow or review us. Sign up at unexplained.co for the newsletter and stay tuned for our upcoming audiobook about apocalyptic disasters. The wind bites through the spruce, a sharp chill traveling across the frozen lake ice. This cold seeps into the bones. Every breath fogs and fades. In these northern stretches, winter is not just a season. It shapes daily hunts and the stories told around the fire. At a dim trading post in the 1800s, fur trade soot clings to the walls and tallow lamps flicker low. Traders jot notes in ledgers, and outside scarcity presses in, hunger that turns neighbors into strangers. Here, the Wendigo Complex comes into focus, a cluster of related Northern Algonquian teachings, narrative motifs, and historical interpretations of crisis, especially winter scarcity, starvation, social breakdown, and predatory greed. Inside a small lodge, the fire cracks against the ice outside. An elder shares a teaching, not to frighten, but to guide, reminding everyone that greed in hard times can fracture the group. The events follow: the first missed hunt, the empty stores, then the weight of choices that could save or doom them all. On a frozen trail, a family pushes through deep snow, breath visible in the bitter air. The evidence is in thinning faces and how one rabbit must feed many. One man feels the pull of desperation, eyeing the group's last supplies with something darker than hunger. That is the human consequence. Scarcity erodes trust, turning a father into someone who might take more than his share and leave others to starve. Go deeper into the paper record, lamplight on yellowed pages from the 19th century. Interpreters note Algonquian words that capture this dread, not as myth, but as lived warning. The implication spreads. These are patterns in how communities faced the ice's grip, balancing survival and shared norms. At a remote camp, the wind howls as supplies dwindle. A young hunter returns empty-handed again, and whispers start, accusations of hoarding. Tension shows in empty pots and hollow eyes. One woman confronts her kin, steady but strained, knowing this breakdown could end them if greed wins out. The human side hits hard. A child watches adults argue over scraps and learns that winter hunger tests more than the body. It tests the group's soul. In the records, we see how these crises birthed teachings and motifs warning against letting scarcity ignite predatory acts. Under tallow light, a trader overhears a conversation in Algonquian tongues and pieces, together narratives of breakdown. The implication lingers. These stories promise a way through, descending into claims and archives, then rising with evidence that honors the ethics of those who lived it. The kettle's quiet creak becomes a motif, signaling warmth against the cold, fire battling ice in the work of survival. We follow that arc with steady, careful evidence. We have framed the Wendigo Complex as our lens, teachings and motifs tied to winter crises, where hunger exposes greed and fractures bonds, with real human costs in trust and survival. We ground this in place and language, winter country geography, Algonquian linguistic ties, and early language evidence. Who gets to name hunger as a moral failing or a spiritual crisis, and what evidence answers that? That creak from the kettle is more than a sound. It's a signal carrying stories across frozen miles. To trace the Wendigo legend, we first need to understand the languages that gave it life. These ancient tongues hold the key to the stories and beliefs that shaped the people who lived in the harsh north. Each word carries the weight of survival, echoing the struggles and fears of those who faced the relentless winters. Words aren't just labels, they're windows into how people survived the North's brutal winters, where hunger could turn a neighbor into something unimaginable. Sharing food wasn't polite, it was life or death, and one Ojibwe term opens the door to what later got written down. Back in the early 1700s, deep in what's now Canada's subarctic, the land stretched under endless snow, the wind cut like a blade, and the trees cracked in the cold. This is winter country, home to Algonquian-speaking peoples, groups like the Cree, Ojibwe, and others bound by related languages rather than a single culture. Algonquian isn't a monolith. It's a family of languages spread across nations from the Atlantic to the Rockies, each with its own dialects and ways. Think of it like Romance languages. French and Spanish share roots, but daily life looks different. That linguistic tie mattered because it carried stories of survival through oral traditions long before any European pen hit paper. A small camp, a cluster of birch bark lodges huddled against the drifts. It is mid-January, and the sun barely scrapes the horizon. A hunter steps out, boots squeaking on packed snow under the faint glow of a lantern swinging from a pole. The air smells of wood smoke and pine, with the gnaw of empty bellies beneath it. Winter here isn't just cold. Food runs scarce, and every calorie counts. In these communities, sharing was not optional. A successful hunt meant meat divided among kin and neighbors because hoarding could doom the whole group when blizzards locked everyone in. One person's greed might leave another starving, and in the tight quarters of a snowbound lodge, tension built fast. Families relied on norms that kept hunger from fracturing bonds, norms woven into the very words they spoke. At a trading post on the edge of Hudson Bay, indigenous trappers met European factors. Snow still squeaked under boots, now mixed with the clink of metal traps and the murmur of bartered goods. Lifeways clashed. Algonquian speakers brought furs and stories of the bush, while clerks scribbled notes in ledgers. Those notes filtered everything through a colonial lens, turning fluid oral accounts into fixed lines. Take a young Ojibwe trapper called Niska, arriving half-frozen with a bundle of beaver pelts. He has seen weeks of lean trails. His family back home is rationing dried fish. He trades for flour and tea, but whispers to the clerk about a neighbor who vanished into the woods, driven by a hunger that twisted him. The clerk jots it down, but misses the nuance, the way the story warns against breaking sharing rules, turning isolation into a monster. Farther inland, a storm-ravaged village. Winds howl, paths bury, and a family of 6 crowds around a dying fire. The father, weakened by months of short rations, eyes the last strip of pemmican. He knows the rule: share or risk the group's wrath. Desperation creeps in. One night, he slips out, boots squeaking faintly in the gale, leaving his kin to wonder if he has become something else, lost to the winter's grip. This is where language steps in. Ojibwe documentation records the term Wendigo, Wendigo minus, with glosses like Wendigo, a winter cannibal monster. It is not static. Plural forms and verbs show it is productive, like Wendigo wag for multiples, or verbs implying to act like a Wendigo. Read it rhythmically. Wendigo, building from roots that evoke fat or grease, tied to excess in scarcity. It morphs, showing how the concept lives in action, not just myth. For someone like that father, the implication hits hard. If hunger pushes him to hoard or worse, the community sees it as Wendigo taking hold, a transformation warned in stories. One elder recalls her uncle, who returned from a solo hunt changed, eyes wild, refusing to share. The family confronted him, but the damage lingered. Trust shattered, leaving them isolated when the next storm hit. At the archive's edge, these verbal forms meet ink. A colonial recorder hears Wendigo in a report of a lost hunter, but translates it flat. A monster tale, stripping the morphology that shows becoming, not being. That skews the record, turning survival ethics into sensational logs. For the trapper's family, it is no abstract. One bad winter, a brother's greed means a child goes without, hunger claiming lives in ways words struggle to capture. So, we've laid the groundwork. Algonquian languages frame Wendigo as a living concept in winter's harsh reality, where failing to share could unravel everything and turn scarcity into something monstrous. Now, the paper trail moves to the Hudson's Bay Company journals that captured these stories in real time. If the language itself carries morphology for becoming or acting like Wendigo, how did colonial recorders convert those verbal forms into arresting anecdotes? That distant creak of a kettle hook might mark the first cracks in a much larger story. Early traces appear in Hudson's Bay Company post journals from the 1700s. These are not mere logs. They're the raw edges where hunger in the winter country begins to show on paper, recorded by traders who were outsiders looking in. Those isolated entries, scribbled in remote forts, plant seeds that grow into full-blown crises. The stakes are clear. Were these survival accounts, or did the act of recording push them toward a forced transformation in how those events were told? Close up on a worn leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, ink faded, but still legible under lamplight. This is a Hudson's Bay Company post-journal from 1714, held in a quiet archive room far from the frozen north where it was written. The entry is short, but hits hard. a note about something called a white go, whispered reports of apparitions in the snowbound wilderness. The recorder was likely a company clerk, stationed at an early trading post along the bay. They were not locals, they were European traders, writing down what they heard from indigenous travelers who arrived to trade furs or pick up supplies. Distance matters. The stories traveled miles through blizzards before landing in these logs, filtered through languages and intentions that were not always aligned. Flip ahead to 1741, a journal from Fort Churchill. This entry describes a group stranded in the winter country, turning to cannibalism to survive the starvation. The account mentions apparition reports too, spectral figures seen by the desperate. Again, a clerk wrote this, recording what those who made it back said, or the rumors that spread through the posts. Inside a small fort, huddled against the wind, a kettle hook creaks over a fire inside a rough-hewn cabin. Outside, snow piles high, and travelers arrive half-frozen, sharing tales the clerk scribbles by candlelight. A man devoured his companion, the entry might read, attributed to a report from far upriver. Often, indigenous hunters or trappers carried those reports across vast distances on snowshoes, their words translated on the spot. Why record it at all? These journals were company business, tracking trade, weather, and any disruption that could affect profits. A story of winter cannibalism was not folklore to them. It was a practical warning about the dangers of the territory, something that could scare off workers or halt expeditions. The clerk's pen turned private horror into an official note, preserved for bosses back in London. Shift the scene to a later echo, piles of stamped correspondence in a late 19th century police office, paperwork stacking up like snowdrifts. These early journal entries did not stay buried. They influenced how colonial authorities viewed such incidents, turning scattered reports into patterns that demanded action. Take one human angle, a trader reading that 1714 note, deciding to stock extra provisions for the next winter party. It might save lives, but it also spreads the story further, whispering about Wendigo figures that haunt the starving. What starts as a survival account can be framed as something unnatural, something outsiders label and judge. A family in the winter country could hear their own tragedy echoed back through these mediated entries. A clerk's translation could twist necessity into a permanent mark, branding survivors and creating rifts or lost trust. The evidence builds. Dates, like 1714 and 1741, anchor it, but the recorder's distance means we are seeing through a lens, not the full picture. Escalate to a dimly lit archive today, where researchers pore over these same pages. The Fort Churchill narrative from 1741 describes winter cannibalism and apparition reports, as the fact states, but it raises questions about how these tales traveled and who carried them. Clerks noted them to protect trade routes, yet that act of recording planted seeds for later interventions, where isolated events became public spectacles. One more scene. A colonial office in the 1800s. Clerks sifting through old journals amid stacks of missionary letters and police reports. The early entries provided precedent, evidence that turned private struggles into cases for courts. The human toll was real. Families torn apart, individuals isolated, as the recorder's framing shifted necessity towards something irreversible, something that defined them forever. So these early Hudson's Bay Company journals from 1714 and 1741 lay out the first written anchors, trader-recorded tales of apparitions and cannibalism in the winter wilds, filtered through outsiders' eyes and turned into material for debate. The Swift Runner case from 1878 to 79 pulls these private horrors into public trials, where colonial policing made disputed claims about transformation. Can a recorder's framing turn necessity into permanent identity? Now let's push the question harder. What happens when translation choices meet police and missionary eyes in a real crisis? We've been sifting early Hudson's Bay Company journals, teasing apart who wrote what and why certain words got chosen in translation. Here a case tests everything. The Swift Runner story from the late 1800s, where famine turns deadly and a disputed claim about transformation locks in like law. Here's the hinge. Swift Runner's confession hits the records in 1879, pulling cultural ideas into a courtroom noose. Some accounts say he invoked a Witico possession. Others frame it as straight-up moral collapse. The disputed claim at the heart of it: consuming human flesh will always turn a person into a Wendigo. If courts and clerks rewrite scarcity as moral failure, lives and legal outcomes are at stake. This is where the archives bite back. Winter in the Athabasca region, 1878. Snow piles high, winds cut sharp, and food runs out fast for families on the move. Swift Runner, or Kakisikuchin as he is known locally, leads his group through the bush, his wife, children, relatives all depending on traps and hunts that come up empty. Days stretch into weeks of gnawing hunger, the kind that hollows you out from the inside. No grand storms or dramatic chases here, just the slow grind of starvation closing in. By spring, rumors reach the trading posts. People whisper about a man acting strange, arriving alone where there should have been a whole family. The Northwest Mounted Police get wind of it and ride out to investigate. They find Swift Runner near what is left of a campsite. Bones scattered, evidence of something unthinkable. He does not run. He talks. That encounter is the event that sets everything in motion. The killings in the woods, born from desperation. Shift to the police outpost, summer 1879. Wooden desks cluttered with ink pots and ledgers. Stamped correspondence piling up from headquarters. Officers sit Swift Runner down, and pens scratch across official forms. His confession comes out in pieces, through translators, maybe a missionary hovering nearby with a Bible in hand. Records note he speaks of a devil taking hold, or Witico in the local tongue, a force that drove him to it. These are not his words alone. They are filtered through the men writing them down, with their own ideas of sin and savagery bleeding into the lines. Provenance matters. These confessions land in missionary reports and police files, later pieced together in ethnohistorical studies. Swift Runner admits to the acts, the cannibalism amid famine, but the framing lives in those stamped pages, yellowed now with age and carrying the weight of authority. No direct community voices unfiltered. It is all mediated by the hands holding the quill. Evidence builds like that paperwork stack, turning personal horror into Exhibit A. Escalation hits the courtroom in Fort Saskatchewan. Gavel strikes wood. Witnesses shuffle in. Traders, officers, perhaps a priest recounting the soul's peril. Swift Runner stands trial for murder, his words twisted into proof of something monstrous. The disputed claim surfaces there, whispered in side conversations or noted in margins. Consuming human flesh will always turn a person into a Wendigo. It is not presented as ironclad fact, but as a cultural echo the court weighs against colonial law. Execution Day, December 1879. Rope tightens at the gallows. A crowd gathers under gray skies. Swift Runner hangs. His case is sealed in those records as the best documented of its kind. Killings in 1878, trial and death in 1879. But implication lingers. When a confession and an execution enter colonial records, did the legal frame convert a situational crisis into an immutable identity? Human consequences hit hard. Think of Swift Runner's surviving kin, scattered and stigmatized, their loss rewritten as a moral tale for outsiders, or the officers stamping those reports, carrying the weight of decisions that favored punishment over understanding. Lives pivot on these interpretations. One family's tragedy fuels decades of scholarly debate, even popping up in modern media with that telltale crackle of radio static adapted for podcasts or films that can gloss over the hunger's bite. Push further into the correspondences, and you see how missionaries pushed for swift justice, blending spiritual warnings with legal muscle. Indigenous communities feel the ripple, their own ways of handling crises overshadowed by imposed rules. It is not just one execution. It is a pattern where cultural sayings get prosecuted, turning whispers of possession into chains that bind. Tension narrows as we trace these threads, from bush camps to courtrooms to dusty files. The Swift Runner case pressure tests how archives interpret desperation, spotlighting that disputed claim without affirming it as truth. It escalates the stakes, showing how policing and missionaries did not just record. They reframed, making famine a forever mark. So, there it is. The Swift Runner saga locks in how colonial pens turned crisis into a fixed label, with lives hanging on every translated word. Institutions did not just document, they dictated identities, reshaping cultural pressures into criminal certainties. Profiles of the figures who held those pens follow: Hudson's Bay recorders, missionaries, police, even indigenous leaders like Jack Fiddler fighting back. Whose hand shaped the story we inherit, and what hidden translations kept certain versions alive? Across Algonquian languages, there is no single name for this entity, just a web of related words shaped by dialect and by the hand that recorded them. Remember how recorders and speakers clashed earlier? That frame now meets the archive. We read the journals with an eye for bias, triangulate terms across sources, and test what holds. The stakes are high. If we get this wrong, we miss the human toll behind the myths. We must weigh quotation against interpretation and settle on standards that hold up the truth. The dim glow of an archive room, dust in the air, and old leather bindings that creak when you open them. Outside, snow squeaks under boots as someone approaches with a lantern, its light flickering through frosted windows. This is where the Hudson's Bay Company journals live. Thick volumes from the fur trade days filled with weather notes, trade tallies, and odd entries about local happenings. Take a typical entry. The clerk scribbles, "Heard from the hunters today. A man turned wild, driven by hunger." But is that a direct quote from the speaker or the recorder's spin? Start by checking provenance. Who wrote it, when, and why? Company men had incentives to keep trade running smoothly, so they might downplay disruptions or exaggerate threats to justify actions. That brings us to translation. Many entries pass through interpreters, missionaries, or local clerks who bridged languages but carried biases. A word whispered in Innu could land on the page, twisted into English, and lose nuance. Scholars study orthography and spelling shifts across dialects to trace back toward original intent. Scenes shift. Out in the cold, boots crunching near a trading post lantern as a translator relays a story from an indigenous elder. The elder speaks of transformation, but the clerk records it as savage superstition. That gap exposes motive. The recorder's worldview colors the record, turning a cultural explanation into something dismissible. To sort this, triangulate. Cross-check a journal with ethnographies, detailed studies from anthropologists who lived among communities, and with language lexicons that map terms. For example, linguistic evidence shows multiple cognate terms across Algonquian languages rather than a single pan-Algonquian proper name. Orthography and morphology vary by dialect and by how a recorder wrote them. It's not one monster myth, but a family of ideas adapted locally. Escalating from paper to people, consider a real consequence. In one case, a mistranslated report led to a hasty arrest. A family already starving through winter saw a kin taken away based on a clerk's loose interpretation. Lives were upended and trust shattered between communities and outsiders. We move to a modern library, where static crackles from an old radio broadcast adapting these tales, a reminder of how stories evolve. Here, triangulation includes archival provenance, tracing a document's chain of custody to ensure nothing was added or altered. Scholars look for multiple independent sources agreeing on key details before they call something corroborated. A researcher uncovers a journal entry that calls a whole lineage's history into question. One descendant learns their ancestors' words were warped and family lore is reframed. The evidence builds, event by event, and patterns emerge. The implication is clear. Some claims survive scrutiny, while others crumble when motives don't align. Finally, in a quiet study hall, apply these standards. A claim survives if triangulated sources corroborate without contradiction. Collapse follows unverified interpretations or biased provenance. This toolbox is not merely academic. It exposes the real struggles behind the ink. So, we've laid out the methods. Read between quotes and spins, triangulate across languages and records, and hold claims to strict corroboration standards. The consequence is clear. Misreads have buried truths and hurt people for generations. We enter the believer's world next. treating the Hudson tradition and community remedies on their own terms. Can this sympathetic retelling stand alone without scrutiny pulling it apart? The wind bites sharp, carrying the bitter spruce tang across the frozen lake ice, where shadows stretch long and the air hums with warning. We've been piecing together the records, building that investigator's checklist to sort fact from whisper. Now we set it aside and step fully into the believer's world. This is the rabbit hole, folks, the proponent side where claims of transformation and ancient remedies appear as lived truth. Listen close. What follows is presented through the believer's lens. No judgment, just the raw pull of these stories. It's persuasive and immersive, and it raises the stakes on what these traditions might mean. Out on the frozen lake, the ice cracks underfoot like a warning, and the cold spruce wind whips through the trees, driving the chill into your bones. In old stories passed down in Algonquian communities, it starts with a hunger that will not quit, a hollow breath echoing inside, an insatiable craving that builds like a storm. A trapper, isolated in deep winter, his supplies gone, the world closing in. He fights it, but the craving takes hold, whispering promises until he crosses the line and consumes what he should not. According to these believer accounts, that is when the transformation begins. Not a sudden shift, but a slow, relentless change. They claim the person grows taller, skin toughening like bark, and that hollow breath turning into a constant gnawing sound, marking them as something other. In some tales, once human flesh is tasted, the change becomes permanent, locking them into a new form, driven by an endless need that isolates them from everyone they knew. These stories serve as warnings and as guides. Elders in the community would gather and name the signs to watch for. That unnatural height, the way the wind seems to howl through their breath, the cravings that send someone pacing the camp edges. One account tells of a young hunter who returned from the bush changed, eyes wild, the cold wind seeming to cling to him. The community did not turn away. They prepared rituals, drawing on tradition to diagnose and pull him back. In a firelit lodge, smoke curling against the night and the scent of burning cedar thick in the air, the rituals unfold as believers describe. Ceremonies center on reciprocity, the core teaching of giving back what you take. Shamans lead chants, offering food and stories to remind the afflicted of human ties, countering the insatiable craving with acts of sharing. In one retelling, a woman gripped by the change is surrounded by kin who feed her broth from shared pots, reciting tales of balance until her hollow breath quiets and the transformation eases as the community pulls her from the edge. These remedies are not simple fixes. They are woven into the moral fabric, stressing that survival depends on mutual care. Proponents point to how the rituals reinforce lessons of reciprocity. Take only what you need, give back to the land and the people. The evidence in these stories comes from those who supposedly returned, lives forever marked but redeemed, carrying the tale as a reminder. The implication is sharp. Ignore these teachings, and the transformation is more than personal. It threatens the group's harmony. Deep in Innu territories, where the frozen lake ice meets dense forest, traditions speak of the Achan, a class of cannibal giants, described in some sources as formerly human, transformed after consuming human flesh. They have distinctive physical markers, like elongated limbs and that hollow breath, and they play a cultural role distinct from other Algonquian accounts. Believers say these beings are stark lessons, wandering the wilds as permanent examples of what happens when reciprocity breaks down, their cravings an echo of failed community bonds. On the human side, a family can be torn apart when a father succumbs to the craving during a brutal famine, his transformation leaving his children to face the cold wind alone. In believer narratives, the community steps in with rituals, but the pain lingers. The son grows up hearing that hollow breath in his dreams, vowing to uphold reciprocity, to honor what was lost. The consequence ripples out, strengthening ties, but underscoring how fragile life is in the North. Further along the lakeshore, another story tells of a trader, driven mad by isolation, who fully embraces the change after repeated acts and becomes something that haunts the water's edge. Rituals failed in his case, believers claim, because the breach was too deep. There was no reciprocity left to rebuild. The message lands hard. These transformations are not random. They are judgments on how people treat each other and the land. Yet at the heart of these claims lies hope, diagnostic rituals that spot signs early, and remedies that aim to restore balance through shared acts. One elder describes a circle of healers who use songs and offerings to quiet the hollow breath, turning a potential tragedy into a tale of redemption. The healed one then carries gratitude and passes the moral teachings to the next generation, keeping the cycle of reciprocity alive against the encroaching cold. As the wind dies down over the frozen lake, these believer frameworks sketch a world where transformation is real, rituals are lifelines, and the core lesson is clear. Reciprocity binds us, or the craving consumes us all. It is a persuasive tapestry, drawn from generations of stories, urging listeners to feel the pull of these ancient truths. So, there you have it, the believer's case laid out in full. Transformation, rituals, and reciprocity as a tight system that explains the unexplainable in these northern traditions. It pulls you in, makes the stakes feel personal, and shows how one slip can ripple out to shatter communities. Skeptics bring peer-reviewed critiques and archival tests to poke holes and introduce counter-evidence. If believers present permanent transformation and ritual remedies as coherent systems, how does the evidence stack up when tested by historical and clinical methods? It's 1879, and you're standing over a stack of yellowed Hudson's Bay Company police reports. Those ritual remedies believers describe, dances and shared feasts meant to pull the afflicted back, sound convincing in their stories. Now they face the archive. Here's the skeptical side, asking sharp questions. Which parts of the believer's account remain plausible after archival and methodological tests, and which read like colonial constructions or interpretive slippage. It's a cold afternoon in 1892 inside a dimly lit missionary office in Northern Ontario. Father Antoine, a Jesuit priest, sits at a scarred wooden desk, dipping his pen into an inkwell as he copies notes from an interview with a local Cree elder. The paper crinkles under his hand, stamped with the church seal. These are the documents that first brought Wendigo stories to colonial attention, reports filled with second-hand accounts of cannibal urges and spirit possession. As scholars pieced these tales together in the 20th century, they coined the term Wendigo psychosis. The claim, a single, well-defined psychiatric disorder unique to Algonquian cultures, people driven mad by hunger, turning to cannibalism with a supernatural twist. Sounds neat, right? But when you test it, cracks appear. At a university archive in 1985, ethnographer Robert Brightman sifts dusty files, cross-checking old trader logs against indigenous oral histories. The evidence is inconsistent. Some cases describe starvation with no mention of spirits. Others frame the incidents as moral failings rather than a medical condition. Brightman argues that Wendigo psychosis as a coherent syndrome does not hold up. It looks more like a patchwork of stories shaped by who was telling them. Take the believer's ritual remedies, the community dances, and shared meals meant to pull someone back from the edge. In the archives they appear, but often through colonial filters. A police report from 1897 describes a gathering where an afflicted man was fed and sung to, then dismisses it as superstitious nonsense. When sources are compared, outcomes vary wildly. Sometimes the person recovers, other times they are executed by the community or handed over to authorities. Marie, a young Cree woman in the early 1900s, watches her brother spiral during a harsh winter. The community tries the rituals, but colonial mediators, traders, and police step in and label it insanity. Marie loses her brother to a jail cell far from home. His story becomes a medical case file. That's the human cost. Traditions interrupted, lives upended by outsiders imposing their own categories. At a conference room in 2010, historians debate these files. Scholars like Carolyn Podrukny point out archival provenance failures. Many reports are third-hand, translated poorly, or edited to fit Western ideas of madness. Recent ethnohistorical syntheses call the evidence inconsistent and caution against imposing Western psychiatric categories. What survives scrutiny is the core idea of Wendigo as a warning about greed and isolation. That thread holds across cases, untangled from psychosis labels. Colonial mediation muddies much of the rest. Community practices such as storytelling circles show up in unfiltered indigenous accounts. They do not match the dramatic transformation claims pushed by believers. Instead, Wendigo appears as a flexible teaching tool, not a fixed disorder. In a modern research library in 2020, digital scans of those stamped correspondences flicker on a screen. Testing consistency across cases, patterns break down. One late 19th century report details a hunter who ate his family and went straight to trial with no ritual cure attempted. Another from the same era shows a successful community intervention. The implication: these are not uniform events. They are shaped by power dynamics, with colonial voices amplifying the horror for their own reports. The human consequences deepen. Joseph, an Ojibwe elder in the 1970s, tries to pass traditions to his grandchildren, but school textbooks reduce Wendigo to a cannibal myth ignoring the ethical layers. Joseph watches his culture flattened, his stories dismissed as folklore rather than living guidance. That erosion breaks community bonds and leaves younger generations disconnected. As these tests are applied, believer claims about a unified psychosis crumble under scrutiny. What's left plausible are the moral remedies as community safeguards. The supernatural transformations read more like interpretive slippage, colonial constructions blending fear with misunderstanding. That sets the stage for media to grab hold, turning nuanced teachings into monster tropes with a crackle of radio static. So after running the believer claims through evidentiary tests, the psychosis label falls apart as inconsistent and colonially skewed, leaving the ethical core intact, while the dramatic tales look like slippery interpretations. Next, the legacy. Popular media repackages Wendigo as pure horror, and contemporary indigenous voices push back with protocol warnings. Who benefits from flattening these complex teachings into something so simple? That old photograph and the fur trader's journal, scrawled in faded ink with a warning about something monstrous in the North Woods, are not relics anymore. They have become fuel for a whole industry. We've sifted through doubts and scholarly pushback, watching these stories twist through the media pipeline and emerge on the other side as something slick and sellable. Now, the real stakes come into focus about who controls the narrative when ancient teachings get repackaged for profit. If the Wendigo has become a marketable horror trope, what responsibilities should producers and storytellers accept when they borrow these narratives? A screen flickers in a dim theater, static cutting through the air like an old radio. On screen, a gaunt figure lurches through snow-covered pines, eyes hollow, breath ragged and insatiable, echoing that motif of endless craving. The Wendigo now appears rebranded for Hollywood in films like Ravenous and Antlers as a monster hunting in the wilderness. Cut to a bustling production set in Vancouver. Crews rig fog machines and fake snow. Directors shout. Actors practice their screams. Modern media, from films and television to video games like Until Dawn and The Forest, reframe the Wendigo as a wilderness cryptid or slasher. The moral and ecological context, the warnings about greed and imbalance with nature, gets dropped in favor of jump scares and gore. Evidence piles up across fan forums and box office reports. Millions tune in, buying tickets or downloading games for that thrill. Zoom in on one creator, an indie developer in Seattle, piecing together a Wendigo-themed horror game late at night. He pulls from online myths and adds claws and fangs, but skips the deeper teachings. The game launches and racks up reviews, yet something is missing: the original context of communal responsibility and environmental harmony. In a community hall in Manitoba, an elder speaks to a group of young artists, her voice steady over the hum of a heater. She describes how these adaptations flatten sacred stories, turning them into commodities that ignore real crises like climate change and resource exploitation in Indigenous lands. One listener, a filmmaker from the Cree Nation, nods and realizes his own project might cross lines, feeling the weight of misrepresenting his heritage. At a university lecture hall, a professor from the Anishinaabe community presents scholarship on cultural appropriation. She cites studies showing how these reframings erase indigenous agency, making the Wendigo a prop for non-native fears. Students shift uncomfortably, and one later confesses it changed her view on binge-watching those shows, now seeing the human cost in diluted traditions and stereotyped portrayals. Outside a film festival in Toronto, signs wave under streetlights and voices chant for respect. Activists hand out flyers with protocol warnings from Indigenous scholars, guidelines like consulting elders, sharing profits with communities, and avoiding sacred elements without permission. One protester, a mother whose son struggles with identity in a media-saturated world, shares how these tropes make her family feel invisible, their real stories overshadowed by fiction. Later, at a virtual webinar hosted by a Native media collective, experts read out authoritative cautions. Approach these narratives with consent and collaboration, not extraction. They warn that misappropriation perpetuates harm, linking it to broader issues like land rights and mental health in communities facing ongoing colonialism. A journalist covering Indigenous issues logs off transformed, vowing to check sources more carefully in her next story. In a quiet library in Albuquerque, a researcher compiles reports on the consequences, youth on reservations feeling disconnected from their culture as Hollywood's version drowns out authentic voices. It becomes personal when an elder recounts losing a relative to suicide, blaming in part the stigmatization of traditional stories, twisted into monsters, and the erosion of moral lessons that once guided survival. In a coffee shop conversation between two creators, one Indigenous and one not, they debate ethics over steaming mugs. The Indigenous artist stresses protocols, seek permission, credit sources, and amplify original tellers. The question lingers about who gets to name the crisis when stories are borrowed, and what happens when profit trumps respect. We can see how the Wendigo's journey through media strips it bare, turning ecological warnings into cheap thrills. Indigenous communities are left to fight for their narratives, and the fallout is real, from cultural erasure to personal disconnection. Weighing what's proven and what remains unresolved comes next, with straight talk on handling these stories with respect. Consider who profits when traditional teachings are flattened into entertainment. Time to see what holds up in the Wendigo story. At the close, we sift the evidence that held, the threads that frayed, and the ethical lines we can't cross. Reflect on who owns these stories and why that matters. The distant creak of a kettle hook echoes in the dimness of a winter cabin, pulling us to those early fur trade days. Soot from tallow lamps clings to the air, faint and gritty, as the past settles around us. As the files close, we piece together what the evidence tells us. First, the claims that held water. Historical records from the 1800s show patterns of extreme hunger leading to desperate acts in isolated communities. Traders and missionaries recorded cases where isolation and starvation pushed people to their limits, supporting the idea that Wendigo stories emerged from real survival crises. Not everything stacks up. The more supernatural elements, like spirit possession or endless hunger, lack concrete proof beyond oral traditions. They remain cultural interpretations, unresolved and open to debate. In a modern office in Toronto, an Indigenous scholar pores over manuscripts under fluorescent lights. She pauses and sets down her pen as protocol's weight sinks in. Contemporary Indigenous scholarship and public-facing notes warn that Manitus and other spiritual relations are context-specific. Speaking about or using them without community knowledge or practice can be deeply disrespectful. This isn't just advice, it's a call to action. For creators and researchers, the guideline is clear. Reach out to rights holders first. Verify if the story is yours to tell, and if not, step back. It's about respect, not restriction. In a coffee shop, a young filmmaker sketches storyboards for a horror script inspired by Wendigo lore. He hesitates, recalls those protocol essays, and picks up his phone to contact a community elder. That choice averts a misstep and preserves cultural integrity instead of turning it into another trope. One human consequence hits home in a reservation classroom, where a teacher shares reframed Wendigo tales as lessons on ethics and hunger. Students connect the stories to modern issues like food insecurity, turning old narratives into tools for resilience rather than fear. Another consequence plays out in a heated online forum, where a researcher ignores warnings and posts unverified claims. Backlash follows. Community members feel erased, their voices drowned out by outsiders. It underscores the real harm in appropriation, leaving relationships strained and trust broken. In a conference hall filled with historians and Indigenous leaders, discussions heat up over attribution. Who gets to name a crisis? Essays point to Indigenous authority, implying outsiders risk diluting sacred knowledge. Questions still linger. How do we balance curiosity with consent? Concrete steps include consulting protocols, citing sources accurately, and amplifying Indigenous voices directly. These are not endpoints, but starting points for deeper, respectful engagement. Thanks for joining us through the Wendigo's shadows. This has been eye-opening. If this episode stayed with you, follow Unexplained History and leave a rating or review to help others find the show. For notes and sources, and to sign up for our newsletter, visit unexplained.co/newsletter. Next time, we dive into the chilling tales of the Jersey Devil, exploring colonial curses and over 300 years of sightings.